So yesterday, I think we were here. I hope you can hear me. Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, fine. So we continue. I want to move fast now because we are going to look at anatomy. Now we are experts in anatomy. We have looked at it. We know where we are. Yesterday, I asked you to go and look at how do you measure GFR? That's just a question. If you have to calculate the GFR and end up with 125 mils per minute, what would it take? What kind of molecules would you use? And of course, you must have found that the molecules must be a molecule that is fully filtered, wholly filtered, and it is not reabsorbed back into the tubules, into the system, and it is also not secreted into the filtrate. So it is fully filtered and it's also given fully in urine. That is a substance that you can use to measure GFR. However, from a clinical point of view, just go to the next slide, okay? Yeah, from a clinical point of view, you'll find that we use certain substances. And creatinine is something you're going to be using all along. Creatinine is a substance produced within the body. It's naturally occurring, released into plasma at fairly constant rates from skeletal muscle. So it is within the system and is always secreted into the tubule. So it violates that one principle. It is filtered, yes. It is given into the urine. It is not reabsorbed. However, it is secreted into the tubule. So it violates that rule. And therefore, it is not very accurate in measuring, but it is used to estimate the plasma concentration of that particular substance. And therefore, if the substance rises, if you measure, because it's easy to measure creatinine, if certain levels of creatinine are high, then you know that the renal function is low. The renal is going to correlate with the renal function. If it is creatinine level is normal, then you know the renal function is normal, GFR is normal. So clinically, from a practical point of view, it's very difficult to find substances. You can't be injecting everybody with the inulin at all times so that you can measure the GFR of a patient. So you use what is naturally occurring in the body, what is produced normally, and that is creatinine. And apart from that provision that it is secreted, also is not secreted in large amounts, it is a very reasonable substance to use to estimate. So regulation of GFR is not something new. It's not going to be anything new. We have talked about it many times during this particular slide, because at the end of the day, it is GFR. If you're going to produce urine, you want to produce it constantly, and you want to produce a certain amount of urine within a certain time. And if it falls short, then you know that you're going to end up with a problem. So what are the parameters that regulate GFR? What would make either GFR increase or decrease? And these are parameters that we have talked over and over and over again. Oncotic pressure, hydrostatic pressure. And hydrostatic pressure is a very important element, and it's a direct factor of systemic blood pressure. So anytime systemic blood pressure goes down, hypotension, shock, you'll end up with urine production being markedly reduced. So every time that you have somebody who has had a road traffic accident or has had diarrhea, vomiting for a long time, or has high fever, a child with high fever of 42 overnight, who has sweated overnight, comes to a casualty department with very low levels of blood pressure, they will always have problems with urinary product. GFR will decrease. So in terms of clinical scenarios that you can put for this particular condition, there are many. And they must be dealt with in a timely manner. That's what we are saying. There's no way you can be told somebody has come with 1 liter running in his arteries and he has bled 5 liters of the road, has come with 1 liter in casualty. The blood pressure is 30/10, the pulse is 160. The person is totally in shock. The kidney at that particular time will be suffering irreversible damage. And it is the timeliness of intervention that is going to save that particular kidney. It's a timeliness. So there's no way you can say, oh, I'm coming in 6 hours. I'm coming in 2 hours. No, if you are asked, hold a patient like this one, you jump onto the nearest Kokoteni and you rush to the hospital to sort out that guy. It tells you there is need for timely intervention. Of course, permeability, we have talked about it. There are many diseases that you're going to learn in second year and in third year, fourth year, fifth year. And all these diseases will reduce the permeability of the filtration membrane as we know it. The fenestrated endothelium, the Bowman's capsule, and the podocytes, which are actually the endothelium or the epithelium of the podocytes, of the epithelium of the Bowman's capsule. Those are the three that form the filtration barrier. Anything interfering with the filtration barrier interferes with permeability, and therefore your capacity to filter 180 liters of urine in 24 hours becomes compromised. And of course, surface area we talked about yesterday. And there are many things, many clinical disease conditions that do away with surface area. Many conditions, many diseases. And that's why you learn the normal. Next. So we have talked about systemic arterial pressure, which is factors into renal blood flow, which factors into hydrostatic pressure, and finally affect GFR. So systematic. So in other words, what we are saying, assume for a moment your systolic blood pressure is 120. It's ideal. 120 is ideal. And therefore it will push blood enough so that 20% of the cardiac output will reach the kidney very easily, very comfortably. And you don't have to struggle about it. When the blood pressure is normal, everything is okay. But remember, then we have said that hydrostatic pressure is directly proportional to the systolic blood pressure or the systemic arterial blood pressure. And to some extent, the renal blood flow, if the pressure is high, even the renal blood flow will increase. And of course, if those two increase, we'll find that the GFR increases. And therefore, we must ask ourselves, the ideal GFR, glomerular filtration rate, is about 123, 125 mils per minute. Would there be a danger if the GFR decreases to 90, to 80, to 50, to 20 mils? Or sometimes in the case of anuria, where there's completely no urine, there are people who actually produce completely no urine. The GFR is 0. Now, as of now, then we should start counting losses. If the GFR goes down systematically, the function of the kidney will also systematically go down. To an extent where if you have anuria, no passage of urine, there are many things that now you will start counting. The body will be waterlogged. The toxins, urea, creatinine, will be high in the body. There'll be no regulation of electrolytes, sodium, chloride. Potassium is of particular interest because when potassium rises, because it cannot be given out in urine, then you'll end up with hyperkalemia and of course cardiac standstill. So anytime GFR progressively goes down, there are definite consequences that you will come across. And therefore, systemic arterial blood pressure must be maintained at all times. If you have an accident, you come when your blood pressure is down. Any doctor who has gone through physiological training must know that they must restore the blood pressure properly, quickly, so that the kidneys can go back to function and end up with good blood supply. If you don't reintroduce good systemic arterial pressure, that patient, of course, will go down. Now, it may also be that you can finally restore the blood pressure, systemic blood pressure, but you have taken too long to restore. So if you have taken too long to restore, initially, renal blood flow, as we said earlier, the renal blood flow not only causes filtration, the renal blood flow also supplies the kidney itself, the cells of the kidney, whether they are glomerular cells or whether they are tubular cells, it supplies these cells with blood, therefore providing it with nutrients, providing with oxygen for these cells to function. So anytime that there is a blockage of blood flow to the kidney suffers double. Its own blood supply to itself is compromised, and therefore the cells start respiring anaerobically, and they end up with what we refer to as the renal tubular necrosis. So if you don't supply blood to the kidney cells, glomerular and tubular cells for a long time, they respire aerobically. If you don't restore oxygen supply for a long time, the cells die. And when they die, they go through what we refer to as renal tubular necrosis. Now, once the tubular cells have necrosed, they have died. It doesn't matter how high you restore the systemic circulation. You are late. Those cells are less likely to recover. So you can restore the blood pressure to 120, 80. You look at your catheter in the urethra, there's no urine being produced because the cells have suffered irreversible damage. So we are emphasizing that the kidneys cannot afford to suffer low blood pressure or inadequate blood supply for a long time. And long is relative. Anytime it suffers more than 4-6 hours of no perfusion, renal tubular acidosis sets in. And it doesn't matter if you struggle very hard, you come after 6 hours, you are cold, you said you're coming, they call you as a doctor, you say you're coming, and you're not arriving. You arrive after 6 hours, 8 hours, and then you restore the blood pressure to the patient. You have restored it late, the renal tubular acidosis necrosis has taken place, and there's nothing you can do. Those kidneys are packed, they're dead. They will require ultimately renal dialysis or kidney transplant. So untimely response from medics like you, trained, talks to, usually causes these irreversible damages to the kidney from a relatively mundane, simple, small, little diseases. So we have seen in terms of low GFR, the damage that is going to happen. What about if the systemic arterial pressure also decided that it wants to go through what we refer to as, it becomes rogue. The arterial systemic circulation goes up, just goes up. The for instance, the systemic blood pressure of the patient goes to 150. So if it goes to 150, it would mean that the renal blood flow will increase. It would also mean that the hydrostatic pressure that is present in the afferent arteriole will be higher. Remember, we said that hydrostatic pressure in the arteriole, afferent arteriole, is about 45. So suppose now it is doubled, it's 90. That pressure will be forcing a lot of fluid out into the Bowman's capsule. Suppose the systemic blood supply goes to 200, systemic arterial pressure goes to 200. What are the effects? What we are saying, what we are asking, what are the effects of increased systemic blood pressure on GFR? So if you're supposed to produce 125 mils in 1 minute, that is a GFR. Suppose your blood pressure, systemic blood pressure is 250. You might find that now you are producing 400 mils per minute of urine per minute. And if you're producing excess urine per minute, what would that mean for you practically? Is it detrimental or is it beneficial? We go back to cardiovascular failure, cardiopulmonary failure. Let's go back to cardiopulmonary failure. We had said earlier that if your pulse, for instance, is supposed to be 72 beats per minute, it means that it is supplying tissues with oxygen and nutrients at that rate, 72 beats per minute. And you would expect that if the heart rate goes to 80, more blood supply would be going to the cells. It would be even beneficial. Now you would supply more oxygen and nutrients to the cell. Suppose the pulse rate goes up to 120. You can reason and say exponentially, then if you are delivering a certain amount of oxygen at 72, now we are delivering even more when the pulse goes to 120. So the question always is it true that the higher the pulse, the more oxygen and nutrients is going to be supplied to the tissues? We saw earlier that that is not true. So if you have somebody whose heartbeat is beating at 220, definitely you cannot assume therefore that now that amount of pulse is supplying the tissues with even more oxygen and the nutrients, and it is good for that particular person. We saw that it becomes detrimental. And how did we decide that it's detrimental? How did we know that it is not good? We said, one, that the heart fails itself. The heart fails during diastole. So if the heartbeat is so high, 220, 250, there'll be no room for diastole. The diastole will be so reduced that the heart doesn't have diastole enough to fill itself with blood. And therefore, it will reach a point when it is pumping at 420 beats per minute, it is pumping nothing into the systemic circulation. So rather than deliver more oxygen and more nutrients, it will be delivering zero because there's no blood that is being pumped because the heart was not given a chance to fill. And second, we said that the heart supplies itself with blood during diastole. So if there's no diastole, the diastole has been reduced so hard, you will find that, hey, when the heart is beating so fast, it is beating at the expense of it supplying blood to itself. And it will reach a point when it has no nutrients, it has no oxygen itself, and therefore it cannot metabolize. It cannot produce ATP. So it will just stop. So what we are saying, a high amount, exponentially, initially, when it comes to 72 to 80 is good. When it comes even to 90 pulse, it's good. the supply is good. When it goes extreme to 220, we are saying that it is very detrimental. Any heart that is beating at 200 beats per minute, it's a matter of time before that heart stops. So when you come to the kidneys, and we have said that the factors that cause filtration are directly proportional to the amount of systemic arterial pressure that is there. Is it true that it is exponential, that the higher the pressure, the better for the patient because he'll be removing toxins out of his body faster and more efficiently, he'll be producing good amounts of urine? Is it true? The analogy is almost the same as that of the heart. So we are saying yes, GFR is directly proportional to systemic arterial pressure, but when the systemic arterial pressure goes too high, too far, then you start having difficulties with GFR. On average, in one day, you should produce about between 1,500 and 2,000 mils of urine. That's what you should produce. That is the rate of production. That's the rate at which the bladder fills. And therefore, on average, you will pass urine about 3 or 4 times in a day because the bladder capacity is between 400 and 500. So if your bladder is completely full and you're producing 2,000 mils per day, it means it will fill 4 times. So if you pass 400 mils, it will fill again, then you pass, it will fill again, then you pass. So on average, 4 to 5 times a day, you will pass urine in 24 hours. And that amount is about 2,000 cc's with an average of about 400 every time that you pass. Now, what are we saying? If systemic blood pressure goes high, hydrostatic pressure is high, rate of filtration is high, the renal blood flow is very high, the GFR will also be very high. So instead of producing 2,000 mils per day, you'll find you're producing 8 liters of urine a day. Distributed in that 24 hours, you will find that you are passing urine at a very fast rate. Every half an hour, you're going out. It reaches a point that even every other 10 minutes, you're going out to pass urine. So it interferes with your day-to-day activity. If the systemic blood pressure was directly proportional to GFR. If God had made it that way, that is directly proportional, the higher it is, the more urine you're producing. First, you will be doing nothing the whole day except passing urine, which is very inconveniencing. Even for a 1 hour lecture, you can't withstand. Everybody will be waking up, going to pass their urine in between. But second, if you pass that amount of urine in a day, you must also keep up with intake. Otherwise, you're going to be desiccated, you're going to be dehydrated, and your cells are not going to function properly. Given what we said earlier, that the cells are bathed in an external environment of water that must be kept constant or homeostatic by whatever forces. So if you are passing a lot of urine, 3-4 times what you're supposed to pass, you must also keep up with the drinking so that you don't get dehydrated. So in other words, the systemic arterial blood pressure, if it is very high, it can condemn you as a person to a job of just passing urine and drinking water. In fact, you'll be sitting next to a toilet and a tap. You are drinking water and you're passing urine, drinking water and you're passing urine, courtesy of your high systemic arterial pressure. However, that is not the case. So let's go back to when it is low. When it is low, we know if you produce less urine, because the systemic blood pressure is going down, it's also not good. If the systemic pressure drops, you'll also produce less and less urine. It's not good for you. We have already said it will have deleterious consequences. you'll develop toxins in your system, and it won't be good for you. Now, on a day-to-day basis, we are then saying that sometimes you may not have a constant blood pressure. It's not possible. For instance, your blood pressure rises when you stand up from sitting down. When you run or you walk briskly, your blood pressure goes up. When you are stressed for whatever reason, the blood pressure goes up. So on a daily basis, our blood pressure is not a constant throughout. So certain activities that every so often makes us have a temporary high blood pressure. And if that was the case, every time you have a temporary high blood pressure, it would be having a serious effect on GFR, and you would have those effects that we have talked about, excess passage of urine. And the same thing, sometimes blood pressure drops. There are certain things on a day-to-day basis, even physiologically, that makes the blood pressure drop for whatever reason. And you can go as a student of physiology and ask yourself, what are the things that can physiologically lower your blood pressure, so that even as you sit there pretending to listen to me, the blood pressure can drop suddenly. Now, if it did that, does it mean that the urine amount is also going to be less automatically, quickly, and potassium will start rising in your system? Because if that is the case, then we'll be living every day worrying about our blood pressure, whether it will drop, or whether it will go high, because it has dangerous effects. Nobody wakes up to start worrying whether his blood pressure will go up or not. Blood pressure goes up and down, but we don't worry about the effect it will have on our kidneys. Why? That is a question that we are heading towards. And the question that we are then going into is autoregulation. The autoregulation. That the blood supply and the systemic blood pressure and GFR is auto-regulated. Auto-regulated. So there's an element that you'll go and look at your books today called autoregulation. So it doesn't matter how high the blood pressure goes within certain limits. It doesn't matter how low the blood pressure goes within certain limits. The capillary pressure, hydrostatic pressure, will always be kept constant, so that both the renal blood flow and the GFR is a constant, even if blood pressure goes up or goes down within a certain limit. That is a serious protective mechanism to the kidneys. And therefore we say that when you have a systemic arterial blood pressure ranging between 90 and 120, the GFR, renal blood flow, will not increase. It will be held constant. I don't know whether that is clear, but you will also go and read it hard and understand it. So in other words, your blood pressure can drop. You have had a road traffic accident. You have lost maybe about, out of your 6 liters, you have lost 2 liters. You have come with 4 liters. That 4 liters will still be comfortable for the kidneys. The kidney will develop mechanisms that will ensure that it continuously supplies itself with blood, even when the only amount that is rotating in that those arteries is 4 liters. The kidney will supply. Even if the blood pressure drops, the kidney has internal mechanisms that make sure that it continues supplying itself with blood. Now let's go back to what we talked about earlier, that there are essential organs and there are some organs that are not essential. If you have a road traffic accident today and you bleed which I always give an example. You bleed 5 liters out of your full 6 liters, and you come to casualty with only 1 liter running in your artery. As we said, when we are dealing with cardiopulmonary failure, that 1 liter will be distributed only to the most important organs for that particular time. And for purposes of physiological survival, that small amount of urine or that small amount of blood will be distributed to the heart, will be distributed to the lungs, and will also go to the brain, because the brain must keep functioning, come what may. It houses the centers that adjust to adversity, the respiratory center, the cardiovascular center. Those centers must be kept supplied, even if the blood is little, because they are the ones that make you survive. They are just pulse rate, they are just blood pressure, they are just many things for you to survive. So arguably, having covered this, we can then ask ourselves, if those 3 organs are essential, we can see why they are essential. But you can also go to organs that you know automatically are not essential. The GIT. You have bled 5 of your 6 liters on the road. You've come with 1 liter. The GIT can be ignored at such critical moments with no consequences, no serious consequences. Of course, you're not going to have a roaring appetite when you're just about to die from, shock. You have severe shock and you're having a good roaring appetite, very unlikely. So why should you send the little blood into? Why should you send the little blood into the GIT? So this is obvious. The skin, we also agree, is not important. That's why people become cold and clammy when they have shock. The blood supply is shut out of the skin. The reproductive system cannot be of priority at that particular time. We must all agree that one is not even debatable. I mean, you are in dire consequences, you are in dire even risk of dying, and you think you're going to be having a nice roaring reproductive appetite? No. You can shut that system even for the next 2 or 3 months and there will be no consequences. And you can go on and on for all the other organs. The question that we come back to, what about the kidney? The body does not consider the kidney essential, doesn't. So the kidney is always also shut out of the essential blood that has been left to go to the heart and the respiratory system and the brain. The kidney is not included among those organs. The kidney is shut down. Now, given what we have discussed about the kidney, the fact that if you shut down the kidney for long enough, you'll end up with toxins. And some of those toxins are lethal. Potassium will be lethal within a short while. You'll end up with a cardiac arrest if you're not careful, and so on and so on. So what I always want to ask here, and it's a philosophical question to a second-year degree student. This one, you must go and find answers to. Do you think God for once made a mistake to classify the kidney as non-essential? If you were to redo it, if you were to reclassify it, if you were to redo it again, would you do it differently? Would you advise whoever made these systems, God, whoever it is, to redo it so that it makes the kidney also essential? Because if you shut the kidneys away for a long time, it will have deleterious consequences to the body. So why did God go ahead to consider the kidney not essential? So I will not try to answer that question here. The answers lie in this animal we are referring to as autoregulation. This animal we are calling autoregulation will provide all the answers to what we are looking at. So if you read autoregulation well, the fact that the kidney will supply itself with the blood has mechanisms of supplying itself with blood, even if the blood pressure drops, or even if the blood pressure goes high. It will maintain a certain blood supply to the kidneys, and it will maintain a certain GFR against all odds. In other words, the kidney elevates itself. Although it has been told it's not an essential organ, the kidney has mechanisms of, at such times, elevating itself to an essential organ. So I'll be asking a second year medical student like you, what are these mechanisms? What are these systems? What is in place that the kidney ensures that despite all the odds, it's still supplying itself with blood? Next slide. So autoregulation you're going to look at. And this is what you're going to look at. This is what I've asked you to go and look at. Part of it, you're going to look at this, how the kidney makes itself essential. By what mechanisms? One of them is called the myogenic theory, which you did in first year, even in anatomy. You will revise it in physiology and you will sit on it. And this is always, there's something we call glomerular feedback. And there's something we call glomerular tubular balance. So there are two terms that I want you to go and look at: glomerular, tubular, glomerular feedback. And second, glomerular tubular balance. It will help you answer. Then myogenic theory of autoregulation. Next, this is work that you're going to do yourself. Next. This also goes ahead to explain the things that we are talking about. So in other words, what I want you to go and do is to go and find out what is autoregulation and how is autoregulation effective. Now, second, the other thing that I want to find out is which other organs in the body have autoregulation, which other organs in the body have autoregulation taking place. So the kidney is one of them. Which other organs do you find autoregulation? Next. Now, it is always very interesting. So we have said the GFR should remain constant. And if your system is working well, autoregulation makes you not even worry about high or low systemic blood pressure. That happens on a day-to-day basis or a minute-to-minute basis. You don't find yourself, because your blood pressure has dropped, now you're not producing urine, or you don't find that when the blood pressure rises because you are stressed, suddenly you are going to the toilet 10 times. No, you don't. You don't even have to worry about it. Your stress can be there, you'll still pass urine normally, the amount of urine that you always pass. So that's autoregulation. But suppose autoregulation fails, and what can make autoregulation fail? It will make, GFR will then fail to be constant. GFR will fail to be constant. Now, there are other things that affect GFR and makes GFR fail to remain constant. So if you have a large sympathetic discharge, you know what sympathetic discharge is? The large sympathetic discharge is usually adrenaline, and it has the effect of vasoconstriction, severe vasoconstriction on the afferents. And then, of course, there's something we call decrease in plasma oncotic pressure. Remember, plasma oncotic pressure within the afferent vessel is anti-filtration. It's anti-filtration. That's why you have that balance. Hydrostatic pressure is for filtration. The oncotic pressure within the vessel is anti-filtration. So if that increases, if for instance, if you decrease the oncotic pressure, we had said earlier oncotic pressure is of a certain amount, 25. If you decrease it, you'll find that the hydrostatic pressure and the hydrostatic pressure remains even the same, the net filtration pressure is going to be very high. So the GFR will increase. So we are looking at what are the factors that make GFR fail to remain constant. Yes, fail to remain constant. Every so often I have to answer a call for 1 minute. Sorry. Has all over these conditions that make GFR stop. Remember, it is just factors there. So it may have nothing to do with systemic blood pressure. Systemic blood pressure is normal, but oncotic pressure, plasma oncotic pressure decreases because either you're not eating enough proteins, you're emaciated, you have kwashiorkor, you have marasmus, all these things. Then the vessel oncotic pressure decreases, and that gives an upper hand to a higher systemic hydrostatic pressure that causes a high net filtration. Next, next slide. I think that's the last one. So can you put the one for tubular? So that we move first. Tubular function.
Okay.
Yeah. Where is Sandra? So tubular function, I think we want to run with this. Remember, we have said that the body undergoes through glomerular filtration. And we have seen how massive that is. Keep up with me for the next 1 second. I will be back with you in 1 second. We have seen the glomerular function. We have looked at various aspects. I want to very quickly go through what we refer to as tubular reabsorption. And this is one of the modifications that the filtrate undergoes. It is very selective and it depends on the body's needs. So if something is not needed or is already in excess in the body, it will be given out. It will not be reabsorbed. If it is needed, it will be reabsorbed. There are certain things that are automatically reabsorbed 100%, like glucose, amino acids. We never waste them. They never appear in urine ordinarily. So they are supposed to be absorbed 100%. You can't afford to waste nutrients. unless, of course, you are either diabetic, in which case you are spilling too much. And there are certain things that we have said are filtered and never reabsorbed. There are certain things that are not filtered but are secreted. So this is going to be what we refer to as the tubular function. And I'm going to emphasize only on the aspects that I think are important for you as a second year body medical student who is about to be released to them suspecting third year to start doing clinical work. Next. So first we must look at what are the mechanisms that are deployed in reabsorption. Once you have filtered 180 mils of water through the glomerulars, the type of capillaries, and it now goes down, how do you reabsorb? What are the mechanisms that move things about? So there's active and passive, and active here means that ATP is used. Passive means that there's no energy, no ATP is used. Sometimes I get surprised when I meet a student in second year about to be released to them suspecting third year. And I ask, what is an active process? As you know it in the last 1 2 years we've been in Chiromo. And what is a passive process? And they look at me and say, these are two new words. Passive, no energy, no ATP is used. Active, ATP is used. And therefore, when you use ATP, you can move things against their electrochemical gradient. So we know usually diffusion, osmosis, things move from a region of high to a region of low concentration. But when you're using ATP, you can force something to even move from a region of low concentration to a region of high concentration. It's already there concentrated, but you're still moving more into it. That's what ATP does. It moves things against the concentration of the passive. On the other hand, there's no energy used, so things will purely use the forces of diffusion. If it is excess on the other side, it will not move the other side. In fact, it will move from where it's excess to where it is less. There's the forces of equilibrium. And therefore, I've given substances that try to utilize these ones. There's glucose, amino acid, nucleic acid, ketones. Most ions will be moved back into the body or out of the body using active mechanisms where ATP is used. And therefore, they can even be moved against the concentration gradient. There can be excess sugar in the body, a lot of sugar in the body, but it will still be reabsorbed against the concentration gradient. On the other hand, water, urea, chloride, move passively. No ATP is required. Sometimes you can have what we call secondary water reabsorption, where you absorb sodium, and then when sodium is reabsorbed and it makes the concentration of a certain area more concentrated, then now it will secondarily absorb water. But water moves basically by forces of diffusion or osmosis. So if there's no water in the intercellular, water will move there. If there's excess water intercellular and there's none extracellular, water will move opposite direction. So these forces are important that you know. Next. So when it comes to proximal convoluted tubule, I want you to listen to me here very carefully, because a third year, a second year medical student doing a degree course is not equivalent to a certificate degree fellow in the school of Angoa. You are a serious person and you must take yourself as such. And if you're loitering here and you're not serious, I think it's better you start looking for a place to go. Don't loiter here and pretend that you're not reading. No. So you must listen carefully when I look at the proximal convoluted tubule. What are the things that are reabsorbed and how are they reabsorbed? This is what I want you to go and look at. What are the things that are reabsorbed at the proximal convoluted tubule as part of modifying the filtrate? So the filtrate has been filtered into the Bowman's capsule with glucose, amino acid, sodium, chloride, potassium, bicarbonate, uric acid, water, all these phosphates. How is it reabsorbed back? So I want to emphasize that you must know how glucose and amino acid is reabsorbed. Now remember, free fatty acids are not here. And if I ask you why free fatty acids are not here, you will quickly tell me that free fatty acids is some of those things that we said are largely, heavily bound to proteins. And since proteins are not filtered, they remain with the protein sometimes in the main blood. You must go and ask yourself, how is glucose and amino acid reabsorbed? It's a very clear pathophysiology. It's a very clear physiological process that absorbs these two. And both are absorbed by active processes. There's actually an active protein that is used to reabsorb these two, glucose and amino acids. And remember, we never allow any amino acids or glucose to be given out in urine in ordinary circumstances, because you need glucose and you need amino acids. If your kidneys were to waste them, it will not be good. In fact, if you find glucose and amino acids in urine, you know automatically that there's a problem with that particular kidney. Either there's a problem with the reabsorption, or there's a problem with filtration. You're filtering too much, as in the cases of diabetes. You're filtering too much, so that even if reabsorption mechanisms are working at 100%, they can't reabsorb everything that was filtered. So how glucose and amino acids, the process by which they are reabsorbed today by this evening must be rotating in your oblongata bongo like hell. Now, out of the electrolytes, I will emphasize some and why. Sodium is filtered in large amounts. Why is it important to know how sodium is reabsorbed in the nephron, particularly the proximal convoluted tubule? First, you want to know how much of the filtered sodium is reabsorbed. Most probably 3/4, two-thirds of the sodium that's reabsorbed is, or filtered is reabsorbed. Why must you reabsorb sodium? Because sodium is an important ion in the body. If you look at the osmotic balance in the body, body osmolarity is dependent on sodium. So the ECF, for instance, has 290 milliosmoles, largely contributed by sodium. So if you give your sodium in urine, if you waste your sodium in urine, or you don't reabsorb it well within the kidneys, you'll end up with problems of osmolarity will be low. And every time you know when osmolarity is low, in other words, there's too much water in the ECF and not enough sodium, you know that the water is going to enter into the cell, and the cell is going to hemolyze. It causes problems. So the balance, the hemostatic functions of sodium become very key. Sodium also is used for many cellular communication issues. If you talk about cellular depolarization, or a nerve getting depolarized, or a muscle getting depolarized, it's a question of sodium moving up and down. So it is used a lot in communication between body tissues. So the functions of sodium, you can talk from now to tomorrow, you do not end. That's why it's important to know how the sodium reacts. And sodium, by the way, is reabsorbed in connection to glucose. If you find reabsorption of glucose, you'll also find something about sodium reabsorption. They are co-transported. And since I've told you to go and look at glucose, you'll combine that with sodium and C. And you must know why sodium is important to reabsorb. Second, the other thing that I want to emphasize is potassium. Potassium. Now, potassium, for the reasons we have talked about before, potassium is not one of those small little things you are going to assume. You must know potassium if you're going to be a very useful doctor. So the first place where potassium is reabsorbed in large amounts is in the proximal convoluted tubule. How is it absorbed, and in relation to who? If there's malabsorption of sodium, if there's excess reabsorption of sodium, you know what is going to happen. then bicarbonate is important. Bicarbonate you cannot afford to be little. You cannot afford to be little bicarbonate. I want you to go and study bicarbonate. So bicarbonate is filtered. And then there are two things that happen to bicarbonate. There is reabsorption of bicarbonate. You need to find out how is bicarbonate reabsorbed in relation to who is it reabsorbed in the body. In relationship to who is it reabsorbed. And the second thing about bicarbonate, and which I want you to go and particularly specifically look at, is the regeneration, what we call regeneration of bicarbonate. So the kidney does not just merely reabsorb the amount of bicarbonate filtered. When the body is faced with excess amounts of hydrogen ions, then the kidney will regenerate bicarbonate to neutralize, to be able to neutralize the excess acid in the body. So the kidney regenerates, and regeneration means that it forms new bicarbonate, not merely reabsorbing what was filtered. If it is faced with a challenge of excess hydrogen, then it will regenerate bicarbonate. And it's important to go to the kidney and find out what process helps regenerate bicarbonate. In other words, create new bicarbonate. Why do we need to create new bicarbonate? The answer lies in the biochemistry of the body. Having covered biochemistry and physiology for 2 years now, 1 year at least, and second year running, it must be obvious to you now. And if it's not obvious to you now, I think it will be obvious to you sooner or later. It will be obvious to you sooner or later that the body is an acid manufacturing machine. If you look at all biochemical processes and all physiological processes, they all add acid into the body, either in form of volatile acid as carbon dioxide or fixed acids like lactic acid, and in fact plus others, acetone, acetic acid, butabutyric acid, all those ones are also added into the body. So the body basically is an acid manufacturing machine. And if we all agree that the cell must always operate at a certain pH range, it means that whatever hydrogen ions acid is produced must somehow be neutralized so that to maintain the body pH. And therefore, occasionally, the total amount of hydrogen bicarbonate in the body is not enough to tackle the amount of acid being spewed out from all biochemical processes into the body. And therefore, we need to manufacture every so often excess. We need to manufacture extra. That is what we refer to as bicarbonate regeneration. Now, out of all this, I'm not assuming chloride. Chloride there is important. And as you look at how things are reabsorbed in the body at the proximal convoluted tubule, you cannot ignore chloride. So chloride will be reabsorbed in the proximal convoluted tubule, the initial proximal convoluted tubule. It accumulates until the later part of the proximal convoluted tubule, where now it becomes excess and it is absorbed. Now, chloride is an important ion when it comes to a certain surgical condition known as gastric outlet obstruction. Gastric outlet obstruction. I think it is not important that I bore you with the details of a surgical condition. But when you reach next year, third year and you rotate in surgery, you will find a number of patients who come with gastric outlet obstruction, the stomach at the end is blocked. So everything they are eating accumulates in the stomach and is vomited out, it's vomited out, it's vomited out, it's vomited out. Now you will note that the stomach produces hydrochloric acid, H, and chloride. This chloride we are talking about. So it is important, very important. So if you have gastric outlet obstruction and you vomit most of your chloride out, you vomit it, you end up with a condition referred to hypochloremia. And if you look at how chloride is absorbed in the proximal convoluted tubule, it is reabsorbed together with sodium. So I want you to go and look at it. So if there's no sodium, chloride will not be reabsorbed. If there is no chloride, sodium is not reabsorbed in that particular part of the proximal convoluted tubule. So there's a certain amount of sodium that is reabsorbed because of chloride. So in gastric outlet obstruction, when chloride is generally lacking, is not there, that sodium that is supposed to be reabsorbed together with chloride, the proximal convoluted tubule, is not reabsorbed. And it always finds itself traveling from the proximal convoluted tubule, descending, ascending, and it ends up in the distal convoluted tubule. We shall see when we reach the distal convoluted tubule what now happens to that particular sodium and how it is reabsorbed and the effect it causes, because you will end up with excess sodium in the distal convoluted tubule, which if it is reabsorbed, you will know that at that particular point, sodium is reabsorbed and potassium is secreted. There's a same port that absorbs sodium and secretes potassium. And it also secretes hydrogen ions. So if you have excess sodium at the distal convoluted tubule, there'll be excess secretion and wastage of sodium, and there'll be excess wastage of hydrogen ions, potassium and hydrogen. So chloride is what I'm simply saying for a second year student. Do not overlook sodium and then chloride. Chloride is important. Look at how it's reabsorbed, and it will explain a lot of conditions later that we cover. Water is important. Remember, we have said that, first of all, 60% of you is water. So that a 70-kilo-old person has 42 liters of water. It's a lot of water in any particular body. So how water is handled by the kidneys, from the proximal convoluted tubule, ascending, descending loop of Henle, distal convoluted tubule, collecting that is going to be important. But of course, we are talking about here the proximal convoluted tubule. A lot of water is reabsorbed. In fact, they will always tell you that 2/3 of water is reabsorbed at the proximal convoluted tubule. And how is it absorbed? Remember, we said it's largely passive. Once things have been absorbed, sodium, glucose, what has been absorbed, water will follow. It's a passive. Water follows to the concentrated area, from at least low area of low concentration to area of high concentration. Phosphate may also be important, particularly when it comes to phosphate and calcium. Calcium and phosphate go together in the kidneys. So you will see how that. So the emphasis for me, I've talked about glucose, amino acid, sodium, chloride, potassium, bicarbonate, with particularly emphasis on regeneration. And then water, how does a kidney handle water? That's an essay question to our second year. How does a kidney handle water? Just water, given that 60% of you is water. And given that the kidney is the most important organ that regulates water in the body. Next, of course, I have deliberately left here hydrogen ion. It's important, by the way, to also look at hydrogen ion, because hydrogen ion is also absorbed in relation to glucose. It is absorbed in relation to sodium. It is absorbed in relation to bicarbonate. So all of these other things that are going to be reabsorbed, you'll find hydrogen ion is key. They are imports for hydrogen ion. So again, the question is always asked, how does the kidney handle hydrogen ion, or the acid-base balance as far as the kidney is concerned? Dr. Dean also covers that. Yeah, so I've only emphasized those ones. I'm not saying that you should overlook anything else like uric acid. I'm not saying you overlook phosphate, and I'm not saying that you overlook calcium. I've emphasized the areas that when I meet you in an eyeball to eyeball phenomenon at an exam, I will be plucking knowledge out of your gut of the bone. Next, okay. So the loop of Henle is an interesting area. Loop of Henle is the descending and ascending loop. And the descending and ascending loop of Henle, largely what happens is water is reabsorbed, and together also sodium and chloride becomes key. So if we look at the descending loop of Henle, descending loop of Henle is impermeable to sodium and chloride. That's the first thing we know. The descending loop of Henle is permeable to water. So what are the most important events that occur in the descending loop of Henle? Sodium and chloride remain within the lumen. It is not given out, it doesn't come in. But water is reabsorbed in the descending loop of Henle from the lumen, the filtrate, into the surrounding tissues. So one may then ask, if these two are happening, sodium and chloride remains within the filtrate in the lumen, and water is being reabsorbed out of the lumen, it would be your guess, which is as good as mine, that by the end of the loop of Henle, the concentration of the filtrate by the end of the loop of Henle, as the loop of Henle turns into the ascending loop, the descending loop turns into the ascending loop. Down deep there, what is the osmolarity of the loop of Henle at a point that it is turning up? Now, let's go back to the Bowman's capsule. Within the Bowman's capsule, within the proximal convoluted tubule, the osmolarity of the filtrate is exactly that of plasma, which is 290 milliosmoles per liter. We always average it to 300 for quick, talking, so that 290 sounds a mouthful. 300 roughly is the osmolarity of plasma, which is the same as the osmolarity within the Bowman's capsule when the filtration has taken place. And it's also the same in the proximal convoluted tubule before reabsorption starts taking place. Now, when the filtrate reaches the descending loop of Henle, at the top of the descending loop of Henle, the milliosmoles is about 290. At the tip down, when it turning to the ascending loop, the osmolarity of the filtrate is 1,200. So we are saying that within the descending loop of Henle, the filtrate concentrates itself 4 times, becomes concentrated 4 times as it goes down. Remember, we said there are 2 types of nephrons, cortical nephrons that have loops of Henle that are just within the cortex, and they are juxtamedullary nephrons whose loops of Henle dig deep into the medulla, dig very deep into the medulla. They are longer, they are parallel, they dig deep into the medulla. So if this one, the concentration is 300 milliosmoles at the beginning, and at the tip down there at the end, it is 1,200. It means that the medulla, the medullary element of the kidney at this particular time will also be very concentrated. You can imagine 1 million nephrons, 1 million nephrons within the medulla or the cortex, with a concentration of 1,200 deep into the medulla. So in other words, we are starting to see that the medulla is always a concentrated place. What contributes to this concentration is reabsorption of water from the descending loop of Henle and retaining of sodium chloride within the lumen that concentrates that particular medulla surrounding to about 1,200. And we shall see why the medulla must always be concentrated. It's a physiological function that serves a certain function. Later we shall see one. As the fluid filtrate ascends, as it ascends to the ascending loop of Henle, there are certain things that also happen in the ascending loop of Henle. The ascending loop of Henle, one, is not permeable to water. Water does not leave the ascending loop of Henle. Is that so? Yes, water does not leave. But sodium chloride is permeable. So the ascending loop of Henle is permeable to sodium and chloride. So as the fluid ascends to the ascending loop of Henle, sodium chloride leaves the lumen, and water remains within the lumen, with the effect that as the fluid, the filtrate, ascends from the bottom of the loop of Henle as it ascends to the beginning of the distal convoluted tubule, the filtrate becomes less and less and less dilute. So it is hyperosmolar down deep as it goes almost to the beginning of the distal convoluted tubule. The filtrate is always considered as hyperosmolar. That concentration of 1,200 milliosmoles that we saw at the depth of the medulla usually disappears by the time we reach the proximal, the distal convoluted tubule. So what are the most important things that occur in the ascending loop of Henle? Water is retained, sodium chloride is reabsorbed, and you will find that the osmolarity changes accordingly towards the proximal distal convoluted tubule. Next slide. We should wait a bit. Next slide. Wow, here. Okay, did you go to sleep? Anyone else? Okay, next slide. This convoluted tube. Now, again, I will summarize what happens. What are the most important things that happen at the distal convoluted tube? There are many things that happen that you're also going to read about. But if I was to ask a second-year medical student, what are the most important physiological things or events that occur in the distal convoluted tubule? And we are talking about distal convoluted, not collecting that distal convoluted tubule. One, the distal convoluted tubule, the first thing that is impermeable to water. No, it's impermeable to sodium. Sodium cannot reabsorb or secreted ordinarily. But in the presence of aldosterone, so there's a hormone that is produced by the suprarenal gland known as aldosterone. In the presence of aldosterone, sodium is reabsorbed. So sodium is reabsorbed at the distal convoluted tubule on condition that aldosterone hormone is present. If it's not present, no water will reabsorb, no sodium. So once you reabsorb sodium, then water is also reabsorbed passively. Water gets reabsorbed passively. Water gets reabsorbed. In other words, that water would not have been reabsorbed again if there was no aldosterone. However, as you reabsorb sodium, there are two ions that are secreted. We talked about earlier. Potassium and hydrogen ion is secreted into the filtrate in exchange for reabsorption of sodium. So aldosterone facilitates reabsorption of sodium and secretion of hydrogen and secretion of potassium ion into the filtrate. That's why you will find that if there's kidney failure, potassium will not be secreted. And therefore it builds up in the body. And you end up, most of the time, if you have kidney failure, you also end up with high levels of potassium, which we have said before is a serious killer once the level has reached a certain amount. Remember we discussed earlier about phylas of potassium. I remind students all the time that if you pass through Chiromo 2 years and you are still a phyla of potassium, potassium means nothing to you, then you have not learned much. The normal levels of potassium in ECF is 3 to 5 millimeters per liter. Anytime it is 6.5, 7, that patient is in danger of sudden cardiac arrest, given what you learned in the cardiovascular system. Again, sometimes I ask, what causes death in somebody who has high levels of potassium? The answer will lie in that electrical activity of the heart that you drew when you covered the cardiac system. That when you have high levels of potassium, the heart undergoes through hyperpolarization. And when it goes through hyperpolarization, it cannot beat spontaneously. It cannot beat spontaneously. You know, the heart beats spontaneously. You don't have to think whether your heart is going to beat or not. It's a pacemaker, so it just beats. Pop, 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 pop. But when it goes through hyperpolarization, then its spontaneous capacity to continue beating is compromised. So if you look at that graph that you do group where there's hyperpolarization below the zero, that hyperpolarization is always because of high levels of potassium. It will kill a patient. So in the kidney here, we can see that in the distal convoluted tubule, ordinarily sodium is reabsorbed at the expense of potassium and hydrogen ion being secreted. Having said that, therefore, you can see clearly from the beginning, if you have kidney failure and there's no aldosterone, there's no sodium reabsorption, potassium will rise because it's not being secreted. Second, hydrogen ions will also rise. Why? Because they are supposed to be secreted by the distal convoluted tubule. That's why you end up with metabolic acidosis and hyperkalemia in a patient who has kidney failure. So whenever kidneys fail, We are not just worried about toxins arising, coming up. We're not just worried about, for instance, waterlogging and lack of regulation of water. More importantly, we are worried about the accumulation of ions. And those two ions are dangerous, hydrogen ion and potassium. If both of them rise, you end up with metabolic acidosis, which also makes cells not function, and you end up with multiple organ dysfunction and failure. And of course, potassium itself to the heart, because there's a cardiac structure. Now, there are many other things that occur in this convoluted tubule. I don't intend to bore you with it. You need to go and look at it, read it, get in touch with it. But for me, a second year must tell me about sodium, must tell me about reabsorption of water, must tell me about secretion of hydrogen ion and secretion of potassium, must also invoke the name of aldosterone when it comes to the functionalities of this particular area. Now, of course, let's go back to our chloride. Let's go back to our chloride. If chloride is not available because you have been vomiting it, the sodium that is supposed to combine with chloride to be reabsorbed in the proximal convoluted tubule is not reabsorbed. So that excess chloride is always presented to the distal convoluted tubule. And if it's presented here, it means a lot of it will be reabsorbed. And consequently, there'll also be a lot of hydrogen ions being secreted and a lot of potassium being secreted. So what do you expect in a patient who has gastric outlet obstruction as far as hydrogen ions and potassium is concerned? It's a tricky thing. And this is one of the situations where you are always wasting an ion that you need. An ion that you need. So let's go back to the stomach. Your stomach outlet is blocked. The body produces a lot of hydrochloric acid. This hydrochloric acid is vomited verbatim. It's vomited a lot when you have gastric outlet obstruction. So in other words, not only will you have lack of chloride, but you'll also have lack of hydrogen ions. And if you have vomited a lot of acid and you have a lot of hydrogen ion being vomited out, what is going to be the status of your metabolic issues in the body? You end up with what we refer to as metabolic alkalosis, because you are vomiting profusely a lot of your hydrogen ions, and you literally waste it through vomit in gastric outlet obstruction. And those are real patients who come. You might find somebody has had gastric outlet obstruction and comes to you after, a whole month of vomiting. How much hydrogen have they wasted? So their body is metabolically alkalotic. They have less hydrogen ions in their system. Now we are hurried to the kidney here, and we are saying, despite the fact that they are having metabolic alkalosis, they are lacking hydrogen ions, what is going to happen to their urine? If you measure the urine of these patients, the urine is always having hydrogen ions. We call it paradoxical aciduria. Paradoxical aciduria. You have a body that is metabolically alkalotic, lacking hydrogen ions. But if you go and measure the urine, you find that the same person is wasting hydrogen ions in urine. It's giving away more hydrogen ions in urine. And questions have always been asked hard when you go to third year next year and you start rotating in the ward and you start seeing these patients, the consultant will ask you, why is it that this patient will end up with paradoxical aciduria? He's wasting hydrogen ions, yet he's metabolically acidotic. What kind of a body can be so stupid? And how do you explain that stupidity? That is a question you'll be asked when you start seeing patients in the clinical area, and you must be savvy, you must be serious, you must know it. I think time is getting finished. I want to leave it there until we meet next week, sometime next week in the afternoon. Is that so, Akio?
Yes.
Yeah, so we meet next week. I think I will pick it up from here.
Thank you.
Okay.